The conference room went silent when my boss said the words. 32 years with the firm, and it ended with a handshake and a severance package in a manila envelope. I was 51 years old, and I'd just become obsolete. I drove home that afternoon with the radio off, watching the highway blur past, thinking about how I'd tell my wife Ellen. We'd built a comfortable life on my salary as a senior contracts manager for a mid-sized construction firm. The house was paid off. Our son Daniel was doing well, but there were still expenses. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for 10 minutes before going inside. Ellen took it better than I expected. She hugged me and said we'd figure it out. That evening, Daniel called to check in, and I told him the news. He was supportive, told me not to worry, said things would work out. Then his wife, Amber, got on the phone. I could hear her voice in the background first, asking what was wrong. When Daniel told her, there was a pause, and then I heard it. Laughter. Not loud, but unmistakable. A snicker, like she'd just heard something absurd. Daniel must have given her a look because she went quiet, but the damage was done. When she finally spoke to me, her voice dripped with false concern, the kind you use with someone you pity. She said something about how tough the job market was for older workers, how maybe this was a sign to think about early retirement. I thanked her politely and ended the call. Ellen saw my face and asked what happened, but I just shook my head. Amber had always been difficult to read. She came from money, the kind of family where everything was handled by someone else. Her father owned a chain of car dealerships, and she'd grown up never wanting for anything. When Daniel brought her home 6 years ago, I tried to like her. She was polished and pretty, always dressed like she was heading to a business meeting even when we were just having Sunday dinner. But there was something cold underneath. She had opinions about everything, especially about how Ellen and I lived. Our house was too old-fashioned. Our cars were too practical. We didn't travel enough, didn't invest in the right things. She never said it outright, but you could feel the judgment. Daniel seemed happy enough, though I wondered sometimes if he saw what I saw. They'd been married 4 years now, and Amber had made it clear she was the one steering their ship. She worked in marketing for one of her father's dealerships, a job that sounded more impressive than it probably was. Daniel was a software engineer, doing well for himself, but Amber liked to talk about their plans like she was the architect of their future. That phone call sat with me for days. I kept hearing that laugh, that dismissive little sound. Ellen told me to let it go, that Amber probably didn't mean anything by it, but I couldn't. It wasn't just the laugh. It was everything behind it. The assumption that I was finished, that I was some relic who'd been put out to pasture. The first 2 weeks after losing my job were strange. I'd wake up at the same time, drink my coffee, and then have nowhere to go. I'd spent 3 decades building contracts, negotiating terms, reading fine print until my eyes burned. I knew construction law inside and out. I knew how deals were structured, how liability was allocated, how to protect a client's interests while keeping a project moving forward. That knowledge didn't just evaporate because someone decided I was too expensive to keep on payroll. I started going through my files, the ones I'd kept at home over the years. Copies of contracts I'd worked on, notes from negotiations, templates I'd developed. I'd always been meticulous about documentation. It was a habit that had served me well. Ellen would find me in the spare bedroom that I'd turned into an office, surrounded by papers, and she'd ask what I was doing. I told her I was organizing, maybe thinking about consulting. She smiled and said that sounded good, but I could tell she was worried about money. We had savings, and the severance would help, but it wouldn't last forever. I applied to a few positions, senior roles at other firms, but the responses were polite rejections or just silence. Amber's words kept echoing. Older workers. Early retirement. Like I was already dead weight. One evening, Daniel stopped by without Amber. He seemed uncomfortable, apologetic. He sat at the kitchen table while Ellen made coffee, and he asked how I was holding up. I told him I was fine, that I was exploring options. He nodded, looked down at his hands, and then said Amber felt bad about what she'd said on the phone. I didn't believe that for a second, but I appreciated Daniel trying to smooth things over. He was a good kid, always had been. He'd gotten his work ethic from Ellen and me, but he'd also inherited a desire to keep the peace, sometimes at his own expense. I asked him how things were going with them, and he said fine, though his tone suggested otherwise. He mentioned that Amber had been pushing him to ask her father for a higher position at the dealership, said there was more money in sales management than in software. I told him to do what made him happy, not what someone else wanted. He gave me a tired smile, and said he'd think about it. After he left, Ellen said she was worried about him. I was too, but I kept it to myself. The next week, I got a call from an old colleague, Greg Portman. He'd left our firm 5 years earlier to start his own construction management company, and he'd done well for himself. Greg said he'd heard about my situation and wanted to meet for lunch. We met at a diner near his office, and he got straight to the point. He said he had more work than he could handle and needed someone with my expertise. Not as an employee, he clarified. As a partner. He wanted someone who could handle the legal and contractual side of projects while he focused on client relations and operations. It was a generous offer, more generous than I'd expected. I asked him why me, and he laughed. He said because I was the best contracts guy he'd ever worked with, and he wasn't about to let me disappear into retirement when he needed help. We talked numbers, structure, timelines. It would take a few months to formalize everything, get the partnership agreement drafted and filed, but he wanted to move forward. I told him I'd think about it, but I already knew my answer. When I got home, I told Ellen. She was thrilled, relieved. She hugged me and said she knew something would come through. I didn't tell Daniel right away. I wanted to wait until everything was official, until the contracts were signed. There was something satisfying about keeping it quiet, about letting people think I was still adrift. Amber had already written me off. Let her keep thinking that. Thanksgiving was coming up, and Ellen wanted to host. She always did. She loved having the family together, cooking a big meal, making everything feel warm and connected. I agreed, though I wasn't particularly excited about seeing Amber. Daniel called a few days before to confirm they were coming. Thanksgiving arrived cold and gray. Ellen had been cooking since dawn, and the house smelled like turkey and sage. Daniel and Amber showed up just after noon. Amber was wearing a designer sweater and boots that probably cost more than our monthly grocery bill. She hugged Ellen, complimented the house decorations with that tone that always felt slightly condescending, and then turned to me. She asked how I was doing, how the job search was going. I told her it was going fine, that I was keeping busy. She nodded, gave me a sympathetic smile, and said she was sure something would turn up eventually. Daniel shot her a look, but she didn't seem to notice. We sat down to eat, and the conversation drifted to their lives. Amber talked about a promotion she was angling for, about a vacation they were planning to Mexico. She mentioned that her father had offered Daniel a position managing one of the dealerships, said it was a great opportunity. Daniel looked uncomfortable, but didn't say much. Ellen tried to steer the conversation toward lighter topics, asking about their plans for Christmas, but Amber kept circling back to work, success, money. At one point, she looked at me and said it must be strange not having a routine anymore, not having a place to go every day. I just smiled and said I was adjusting. After dinner, while Ellen and Amber were in the kitchen, Daniel pulled me aside and apologized again for her behavior. He said she didn't mean to be insensitive, that she just didn't understand what it was like to lose a job. I told him it was fine, that I wasn't offended, but I could see the strain on his face. He looked exhausted. He said things had been tense between them lately, that Amber had very specific ideas about their future and wasn't interested in compromise. I asked him what he wanted, and he paused. He said he didn't know anymore. It was a sad thing to hear from your son, that uncertainty. I told him he didn't know anyone a life he didn't want to live. He nodded, but I wasn't sure he believed it. They left before dessert, Amber claiming she had an early morning meeting. Ellen was disappointed, but I was relieved. The following week, Greg called. The partnership papers were ready. We met at his lawyer's office and signed everything. I was now a co-owner of Portman and Associates. Greg had already lined up 3 major projects, and my cut would be substantial, more than I'd been making at my old job. We agreed to keep things low-key for now, let the work speak for itself. I told Ellen that night, and she cried happy tears. I still didn't tell Daniel. I wanted him to focus on figuring out his own situation without feeling like he needed to celebrate mine. Christmas came and went quietly. Daniel and Amber had gone to her parents' place in Colorado, so we didn't see them. January arrived with snow and cold, and I threw myself into work. The projects Greg had brought in were complex, involving multiple subcontractors, tight deadlines, and significant liability exposure. I spent my days drafting contracts, reviewing bids, negotiating terms. It was the kind of work I'd always loved, the kind that required precision and strategic thinking. By February, we'd closed 2 of the 3 projects, and the clients were thrilled. Greg told me he'd already had inquiries from other companies wanting to work with us. Word was spreading. One afternoon, I was at the office when my phone rang. It was Daniel. He sounded upset, asked if he could come by the house later. I told him of course, and that evening he showed up alone. Ellen made tea, and we sat in the living room. Daniel looked like he hadn't slept in days. He said he and Amber had been fighting constantly. She wanted him to quit his software job and take her father's offer. She'd even gone behind his back and told her father he was interested, setting up meetings without asking him. Daniel had refused, and Amber had accused him of being ungrateful, of not thinking about their future. She'd said he was just like me, stuck in the past, unwilling to take risks. That last part stung, though Daniel apologized immediately for repeating it. I told him not to worry about it, that what mattered was what he wanted for his life. He said he didn't want to work for her father. He liked his job, liked the independence, liked solving problems with code instead of dealing with people's egos. But Amber had made it clear that if he didn't take the dealership job, she'd consider it a betrayal. I asked him what that meant, and he said he didn't know, but it felt like an ultimatum. Ellen reached over and took his hand, told him he needed to do what was right for himself, not what kept the peace. He stayed for another hour, and by the time he left, he seemed a little steadier. 2 weeks later, he called and said he'd made a decision. He was staying in software, and he'd told Amber that he wasn't going to change his mind. She'd been furious, had spent 3 days barely speaking to him, but he'd held firm. I was proud of him. March brought more business. Greg and I had hired 2 junior associates to help with the workload, and we were fielding calls from companies we'd never worked with before. Our reputation was growing faster than either of us had anticipated. One of our new clients was a large commercial developer that had projects across 4 states. The contract negotiations were intense, involving million-dollar clauses and intricate liability structures, but I knew this territory. I'd spent 3 decades preparing for exactly this kind of work. We closed the deal in early April, and our firm had already exceeded revenue projections for the entire year. Around that same time, Daniel called with news. He and Amber were separating. He said it had been building for months, that the fight over her father's job offer was just the breaking point. Amber had moved back to her parents' house, and they were starting the process of dividing assets. He sounded sad but also relieved. Ellen invited him over for dinner that weekend, and he accepted. He looked thinner, tired, but there was something lighter about him too. We didn't talk much about Amber. Instead, we talked about his work, his friends, his plans. He said he was thinking about getting his own place, maybe something smaller and simpler than the house they'd shared. Ellen encouraged him, said a fresh start might be exactly what he needed. By late April, the divorce proceedings were underway. Daniel had hired a lawyer, and Amber's father had hired one of those aggressive types who treated every divorce like a war. They were fighting over the house, over savings, over things that seemed petty from the outside but clearly mattered to Amber. One evening, Daniel called and asked if I could help him understand some of the financial documents his lawyer had sent over. I told him to bring them by. The documents were dense, full of legal jargon and projected asset valuations. I went through them with him, explaining what each section meant, where the leverage points were, what he should push back on. Daniel listened carefully, taking notes. By the end of our session, Daniel had a clear picture of his position. He thanked me, said he didn't know what he'd do without my help. I told him he'd have figured it out, but I was glad to be useful. The divorce dragged on into summer, but Daniel held firm against Amber's demands. They reached a settlement in July. Daniel kept his retirement accounts and his car. Amber got the house and a portion of the savings. It wasn't perfect, but it was fair. Daniel moved into a small apartment near his office and seemed genuinely happy about it. He said it felt like his space, like he could finally breathe. In August, Greg and I signed another major contract, this one with a municipal government for a public infrastructure project. It was the kind of project that would run for 3 years and generate steady revenue. One Saturday in September, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. He had someone with him, a woman named Claire. She was a project manager at a tech firm, someone he'd met through work. They'd been seeing each other for a few weeks, and he wanted us to meet her. Claire was warm and easy to talk to, the kind of person who asked genuine questions and listened to the answers. Ellen loved her immediately. Over lunch, Claire mentioned that she'd heard about Portman and Associates, said we'd been recommended by a colleague of hers whose company we'd worked with. She didn't know I was one of the partners until Daniel mentioned it. She seemed impressed, said the feedback she'd heard was glowing. October arrived with cool air and falling leaves. Greg and I were invited to speak at a regional construction management conference, sharing insights on contract negotiation and risk mitigation. The audience was full of younger professionals, people eager to learn, and I realized I enjoyed teaching. One evening, Ellen told me she'd run into Amber's mother at the grocery store. The conversation had been brief and awkward. Amber's mother mentioned that Amber was doing well, had gotten a new job in Denver, was moving on with her life. Ellen said she'd wished her well and left it at that. I didn't ask for more details. Amber was part of Daniel's past now, and I had no interest in revisiting it. In November, just before Thanksgiving, Daniel called with unexpected news. He'd been going through some old boxes from the house he'd shared with Amber, things she'd left behind when she moved out. One of the boxes contained documents, financial records that Amber had kept. Daniel had glanced through them and found something strange. There were contracts, agreements related to her father's dealerships, and Daniel's name was on several of them. He didn't remember signing anything, but there they were, documents indicating he'd agreed to guarantee certain business loans, co-sign on property deals, things that could have put him on the hook for hundreds of thousands of dollars if anything went wrong. He asked if I could look at them. I told him to bring them over immediately. When he arrived, I could see the worry on his face. The documents were real, notarized and filed, but the signatures didn't look quite right. I pulled out a magnifying glass and examined them closely. The handwriting was similar to Daniel's, but not exact. Someone had forged his signature. I asked Daniel if he'd ever given Amber power of attorney or signed any blank forms. He said no, absolutely not. I told him this was fraud, and he needed to contact a lawyer immediately. I also told him to pull his credit report and check for any accounts or liabilities he didn't recognize. We spent the rest of the evening going through every document. There were at least 6 contracts, all forged, all potentially disastrous. Daniel was shaking by the time we finished. He said he couldn't believe Amber would do this, but I could. People did terrible things when they felt entitled, when they thought they could get away with it. The next day, Daniel met with a lawyer who specialized in fraud and contract disputes. The lawyer confirmed what I'd suspected. The signatures were forged, and Amber had likely done it to secure favorable terms for her father's business deals, using Daniel's credit and income as leverage without his knowledge. The lawyer said Daniel could press criminal charges, but that would be a long and ugly process. Alternatively, he could demand that Amber and her father void the contracts and remove his name from all documents, threatening legal action if they refused. Daniel chose the latter. He wanted this over with, not dragged out in court for years. The lawyer sent a formal demand letter, outlining the forgery, attaching handwriting analysis, and making it clear that failure to comply would result in criminal charges and a civil suit. Within a week, Amber's father's lawyer responded. They agreed to void all contracts and remove Daniel's name. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a sterile legal agreement. But it was enough. Daniel was free and clear. He thanked me over and over, said I'd saved him from a nightmare he didn't even know he was in. I told him I was just glad he'd found those documents before something went wrong. December came, and with it, a sense of closure. Daniel was doing well, his relationship with Claire was getting serious, and he seemed genuinely happy. Ellen and I were planning a trip to the coast for the spring, something we'd talked about for years but never made time for. The business was thriving. Greg and I had promoted one of our junior associates and were looking at larger office spaces. One afternoon, Ellen suggested we host Christmas dinner again. I agreed, and she invited Daniel and Claire. They accepted enthusiastically. Claire even offered to bring dessert. On Christmas Eve, I found myself in the living room, looking at the tree Ellen had decorated, thinking about the past year. I'd started it unemployed, dismissed, written off. I was ending it as a partner in a successful firm, financially secure, respected by colleagues and clients alike. Christmas Day was everything Ellen had hoped for. Daniel and Claire arrived with wine and pie, and the 4 of us spent the afternoon cooking together. Claire fit seamlessly into our little family, teasing Daniel, complimenting Ellen's cooking, asking me about the business with genuine curiosity. Over dinner, Daniel raised his glass and said he wanted to make a toast. He thanked Ellen and me for always being there, for never judging him, for helping him through the hardest year of his life. He said he'd learned what real partnership looked like by watching us, and he hoped he could build something half as strong with Claire. Ellen teared up, and I felt a swell of pride. This was what mattered. Not the contracts, not the revenue, not the professional recognition. It was this: family, connection, love. After dinner, Claire pulled me aside. She said Daniel had told her everything about Amber, about the forgery, about how I'd helped him navigate it all. She thanked me, said she didn't know if Daniel would have gotten through it without my support. I told her Daniel was stronger than he gave himself credit for, but I appreciated her saying so. As the evening wound down, I found myself thinking about Amber. I wondered if she knew what she'd lost. Not Daniel's income or status, but Daniel himself. A good man, honest and kind, someone who deserved better than what she'd given him. January arrived with snow and new projects. Greg and I were busier than ever, traveling to site inspections, meeting with clients, drafting proposals. We hired 2 more associates and moved into a larger office downtown. The business had exceeded every expectation, and we were starting to get inquiries from out of state. One afternoon, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. The voice on the other end was familiar, though I hadn't heard it in almost 2 years. It was Amber. She said she'd heard about my success, about Portman and Associates, about the contracts we'd landed. She said she wanted to congratulate me, that she was happy things had worked out. I didn't believe her for a second. Her voice was tight, strained, like the words were being pulled out of her. I thanked her politely and waited to see what she really wanted. There was a pause, and then she said she'd been thinking about that phone call, the one after I'd lost my job. She said she'd been insensitive, that she hadn't understood what I was going through. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was close. I told her I appreciated her reaching out, but that it didn't change anything. What was done was done. She went quiet, and then she said something that surprised me. She said she'd made a lot of mistakes, that she'd been so focused on what she thought success looked like that she'd missed what actually mattered. She said she regretted how things had ended with Daniel. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to tell her that regret was useless without change, that words didn't undo actions. But another part of me, the part that remembered the young woman Daniel had brought home 6 years ago, felt something like pity. So I just said I hoped she found what she was looking for. She thanked me and hung up. I told Ellen about the call later that evening. She asked how I felt about it, and I said I wasn't sure. Maybe Amber really did regret her choices. Or maybe she was just uncomfortable knowing that the man she'd laughed at, the man she'd dismissed as a washed-up relic, was doing better than she'd ever imagined. Either way, it didn't matter. My life wasn't about proving anything to Amber. It was about building something meaningful with the people I loved, doing work that challenged and fulfilled me, and living with integrity. The rest was just noise. Spring arrived with warmth and renewal. Ellen and I took that trip to the coast we'd been planning, spent 2 weeks walking on the beach, eating fresh seafood, and watching the sunset over the ocean. It was the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. When we got back, Greg told me we'd been invited to bid on a federal infrastructure project, one of the largest contracts either of us had ever seen. We spent weeks preparing the proposal, and when we submitted it, I felt a surge of pride. In early May, we got the news. We'd won the contract. Greg was ecstatic, already talking about hiring more staff, expanding our services. I was more measured, but no less pleased. This was validation not just of our work, but of the principles that had guided me for 3 decades. Precision, integrity, and competence. Those things didn't become obsolete. They just became rarer, and therefore more valuable. One evening, Daniel stopped by with Claire. They had news. They were engaged. Ellen cried and hugged them both, and I shook Daniel's hand, told him I was proud of him. Claire showed us the ring, and we toasted with champagne Ellen had been saving for a special occasion. They talked about wedding plans, about building a life together, about the future. Watching them, I realized how far we'd all come. Daniel had found happiness after heartbreak. I'd found success after dismissal. Ellen had held us all together with her quiet strength and unwavering love. As they left that night, Daniel turned to me and said he'd learned something over the past year. He said he'd learned that people will always underestimate you if you let them, but that the real power is in proving them wrong not with words but with action, not with anger but with excellence. I told him he was exactly right. That was the lesson. Not revenge, not bitterness, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing your worth and living accordingly. Summer came with more growth and recognition. Portman and Associates was now one of the most respected firms in the region. In September, Daniel and Claire got married in a small ceremony at a vineyard overlooking the valley. It was intimate and beautiful, everything a wedding should be. Ellen cried through the entire ceremony, and I had to blink back a few tears myself. Watching Daniel stand there, looking at Claire with such love and certainty, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not just for his happiness, but for everything we'd been through to get here. The struggles, the setbacks, the quiet moments of doubt. They'd all led to this. As the sun set over the vineyard and the guests laughed and danced, I stood with Ellen, her hand in mine, and thought about the past 2 years. I'd lost a job and gained a partnership. I'd been dismissed and then vindicated. I'd watched my son suffer and then thrive. And through it all, I'd learned that success isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right. About knowing your worth, trusting your abilities, and refusing to let anyone else define your value. Amber had laughed when I lost my job. She dismissed me as obsolete, as finished, as a relic of the past. But she wasn't laughing anymore. And honestly, I didn't care whether she was or wasn't. Because this life, this moment, this family, the respect I'd earned, the business I'd built, the son who stood before me now as a man who knew his own worth, that was the real victory. That was everything that mattered. The contracts had been read, the signatures verified, and the truth was clear. I was exactly where I was supposed to be,